On the first morning of the new year, the frost lay thick over the village of Lockdub, turning the harbour ropes into stiff white cords and the hills beyond into pale silhouettes against a pearl-grey sky. The celebration at the old Kilmuir house had ended only hours earlier, yet the echoes of laughter and music had already been swallowed by a silence broken only by the distant crash of waves. It was in that silence that the body was discovered. Angus McCrae, a wealthy property developer with ambitions that had unsettled half the county, was found seated upright in the drawing-room armchair, a crystal glass still resting loosely in his hand. A single bullet wound marked his temple. The curtains were drawn, the fire burned low, and the heavy oak door to the room was locked from the inside. The gathering the previous night had been small but strained. Angus had invited a select circle of his estranged wife Morag, his business partner Callum Fraser, the local councillor Fiona Grant, and 2 neighbouring estate owners whose land he had tried to acquire. Witnesses later agreed that the final toast had been made just before midnight. Fireworks from the harbour had briefly lit the windows in bursts of gold and red, and the sound of cheers drifted up the hill. After that, Angus had declared he wished to retire to the drawing-room alone, claiming he had a headache. No one saw him alive again. When Morag attempted to summon him for breakfast, she found the door locked. Calls through the wood brought no response. A spare key was kept in a small porcelain jar in the kitchen, yet it too was missing. Panic spread quickly through the house. Callum forced a window open from the outside, climbing in over the sill. We unlatched the door from within, and the others entered to find Angus exactly as he had been placed upright, composed, almost serene, except for the dark stain at his temple and the unmistakable stillness of death. The pistol lay on the carpet several feet away, far beyond the reach of his hand. At first glance, it looked like suicide staged poorly. Yet the details unravelled that motion almost at once. The angle of the wound suggested the shooter had been standing to Angus' left, not seated before him. The pistol, legally registered to Angus, bore no visible fingerprints, not even his own. More troubling still was the state of the room. The windows were latched from the inside. The chimney was too narrow for passage. The only door had been locked, and the key was nowhere to be found. And then there was the ribbon. A thin strip of bright red satin ribbon lay draped across Angus' lap, as if carelessly dropped there. It did not belong to any decoration in the house. The Christmas garlands were green and gold, the table runners silver. No one at the gathering had worn red ribbon in their hair or clothing. It was vivid, almost theatrical against the muted tones of the room. One end had been cut cleanly, the other appeared torn, as though ripped from something in haste. It seemed absurdly out of place. A festive fragment in a room heavy with death. Word reached Police Constable Hamish Macbeth just as he was finishing his morning tea in his small cottage by the shore. The knock on his door came sharp and urgent, carried by a breathless village lad sent from the house. Hamish listened without interruption, his brow furrowing not at the mention of the gunshot, nor even the locked room, but at the detail of the ribbon. He set down his mug slowly, drawing on his greatcoat with deliberate calm. As he walked up the hill toward Kilmuir House, the villagers were already whispering. Angus McCrae had not been beloved. His plans for new holiday cottages had threatened grazing land and ancient footpaths alike. There were motives aplenty scattered like footprints in fresh snow. Yet Hamish knew that obvious motives often clouded the truth rather than illuminated it. Inside the drawing room, he paused at the threshold before stepping in. The air smelled faintly of cordite and dying embers. Angus sat as though awaiting a final toast, his lifeless gaze fixed toward the window. Hamish's eyes moved methodically. The pistol, the chair, the locked door mechanism, the carpet disturbed, only near the window where Callum had climbed through. Then he saw the ribbon. He crouched, studying it without touching, noting the way it lay across Angus' lap, not fallen but placed. The clean-cut end suggested scissors, the torn end suggested haste, and the brightness of the colour so deliberate, so bold, spoke not of accident but intention. A locked room, a missing key, a weapon wiped clean, and a ribbon that seemed to belong to nothing and no one. It was either the simplest of crimes wrapped in unnecessary drama, or a meticulously constructed puzzle meant to mislead. Hamish rose slowly, his gaze drifting to the drawn curtains and the faint outline of frost along the window panes. "Too neat," he murmured under his breath. "Far too neat to be unsolvable." "Too neat," he murmured under his breath. "Far too neat to be unsolvable." Hamish stepped fully into the room at last, careful to disturb nothing. The others hovered behind him, Morag pale and rigid, Callum shifting his weight from foot to foot, Fiona Grant with her arms folded tightly across her chest as though warding off the cold. One of the neighbouring estate owners had begun muttering about police procedures, but Hamish silenced him with a mild glance. "Best leave the talking until I've had a look," he said quietly. He moved first to the door. The lock showed no splintering, no scratch marks that might suggest tampering. He tested it gently. It turned smoothly under his hand. "You're certain it was locked?" he asked without turning. "Aye," Morag answered at once. "I tried it myself. It would not budge." "And the key?" "In the kitchen jar," Callum replied. "Always has been." Hamish gave him a slow look. "You said it was missing." "It was," Callum insisted. "Gone when we looked." Hamish nodded, then crossed to the window Callum had forced. The frost along the sill was broken where Callum's boots had scraped through, but elsewhere the thin crystalline layer remained intact. No second set of prints marked the garden below. The snow that had fallen lightly in the early hours lay smooth and unbroken except for the cluster of footprints made after the discovery. If someone had left through the window during the night, they would have left a trail. There was none. He crouched by the body again, studying Angus' hand. The fingers were relaxed, not clenched. There was no residue on the skin, no blackened smudge that might suggest he had fired the weapon himself. Hamish glanced at the pistol on the carpet, then at the ribbon once more. "Who decorated the house for the new year?" he asked suddenly. Fiona Grant blinked. "The staff did, though most of them left before midnight. It was meant to be a private affair." "No red decorations?" he pressed. "No," Morag said firmly. "Angus hated red, said it was vulgar." Hamish's brow lifted slightly. "Hated it, did he?" "Aye, he had the Christmas ribbons replaced just last week because they were too bright." That detail lingered in the air like a faint draught. Hamish leaned closer to the ribbon, this time producing a handkerchief to lift it gently. The satin caught the light, revealing faint indentations near the torn Entini pinpricks in a straight line, as though it had once been stitched to something. He turned it over and found a faint dusting of glitter along one edge. Not the fine powder used on Christmas ornaments, but something coarser. "Did anyone wear a sash last night?" he asked mildly. Blank looks met him. "No," Fiona said. "It wasn't that sort of party." Hamish rose and crossed to the mantel. The framed photographs there were arranged with careful symmetry, Angus shaking hands with council members, Angus at a groundbreaking ceremony, Angus alone against the Highland hills. One frame, however, sat slightly askew, its glass cracked in one corner. He straightened it absently and noticed the thin line of dust beneath, recently disturbed. Something had been removed from that spot and replaced in haste. Behind him, Callum cleared his throat. Surely this is straightforward. Angus had enemies, aye, but he was troubled. Business pressures. Had been drinking heavily. Hamish turned slowly. Drinking heavily enough to shoot himself and wipe the gun clean after. Callum's face flushed. "I am only saying what seems likely." "What seems likely," Hamish repeated softly. He moved toward the small writing desk near the window. A decanter and 2 glasses sat upon it. Only one glass had been in Angus' hand, yet the second bore a faint smear along the rim, as though it had been hastily wiped, but not thoroughly enough. Hamish bent closer. A trace of lipstick pale, nearly colourless, clung to the edge. Morag noticed his attention and stiffened. "I don't wear lipstick," she said quickly. "No?" Hamish replied, his tone neutral. Fiona gave a short laugh that died too quickly. "Neither do I." The 2 estate owners exchanged uneasy glances. Hamish said nothing, but his gaze lingered on Fiona a fraction longer than necessary. She met it steadily, though a pulse fluttered visibly at her throat. He returned to the door once more, running his fingers along the inner frame. There, almost hidden in the shadow near the hinge, was a faint scrape in the wood fresh, and narrow, as though something thin had been slid between door and jamb. Not enough to force it open, but perhaps enough to manipulate something inside. "A locked room can be locked from the outside," he said quietly, almost to himself. No one answered. The ribbon in his hand, the white pistol, the missing key. The second glass each detail was small, insignificant on its own. Yet together they formed the faint outline of design. Someone had wished this to look impossible. Someone had relied on panic and spectacle to obscure the ordinary mechanics of murder. Hamish folded the ribbon carefully into his pocket. "No one leaves Lochdub," he said at last, his voice calm but carrying unmistakable authority. "Not until we've untangled how a man who hated red came to die with it laid across his lap." The command settled heavily over the room, and though no one protested, the subtle tightening of shoulders and exchanged glances told Hamish more than any immediate objection could have. The spectacle of shock was already giving way to calculation. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make each of them aware of it, then gestured toward the dining room. "Well, speak one at a time." Morag went first. She sat upright at the long oak table, hands folded so tightly her knuckles blanched. Up close, her composure seemed practiced rather than natural. "Angus and I had our differences," she began before Hamish had even asked. "But we were civil last night. It was meant to be a fresh start." "A fresh start?" Hamish asked mildly. "He promised to reconsider selling the East Fields. They've been in my family for generations." "And did you believe him?" Her lips thinned. "I wanted to." She described the evening careful of drinks before dinner, a tense discussion about planning permissions, a toast at midnight. Yet when Hamish asked who poured the final round of whiskey, she hesitated a fraction too long. "Callum did," she said at last. "I think." "You think?" There was music, fireworks. It was chaotic. Hamish nodded but made no comment. When he asked whether she had gone near the drawing room after Angus retired, her answer came quickly, almost too quickly. "No, I went straight to my room." "And you slept?" "Of course." "Through the gunshot?" Her gaze flickered. "I heard nothing." Lochdub was not a place where gunshots passed unnoticed. Callum Fraser proved more expansive. He leaned forward, eager, hands spread in a show of openness. Angus was under pressure, he insisted, investments falling through. The council dragging its feet. He was furious with Fiona, if you must know. Fiona, waiting near the window, stiffened visibly. "You poured the last drinks," Hamish said. "Aye, just a friendly gesture. 2 glasses in the drawing room." Callum blinked. He must have taken one with him earlier. The second had lipstick. Callum's jaw tightened. Then perhaps he wasn't as alone as we thought. It was an answer too smooth, too ready. Hamish watched him closely. "You forced the window this morning." "Yes, to get in." "You were certain the door was locked before trying the window?" "Morag tried it. It wouldn't open." "So you never tested it yourself?" Callum's confidence faltered. "No, there was no need. When Fiona Grant took the seat, she crossed her legs deliberately, chin raised. 'If you're suggesting I had reason to kill him, you're wasting your time,' she said coolly. Yes, we disagreed. He wanted those cottages pushed through without environmental review. I refused. You argued last night, Hamish said. We debated. Voices were raised. She gave a brittle smile. Angus never spoke softly. And after midnight, I remained in the hall speaking with the MacLeans. Then I went upstairs. Alone. You wear lipstick, counsellor? Her hand rose instinctively to her mouth before she caught herself. Not that shade. Hamish did not miss the gesture. The 2 neighbouring estate owners, the MacLeans, offered a synchronised account to synchronised. They had left the drawing room just before Angus did, they said. They heard nothing unusual, saw nothing suspicious. Yet when asked separately about the time, one insisted it was 5 minutes past midnight, the other nearly half past. A small discrepancy perhaps, but in a night compressed by fireworks and tension, time mattered. With each statement the shape of the evening shifted slightly. Morag claimed exhaustion, yet her eyes were clear, unshadowed. Callum emphasised suicide with curious insistence. Fiona deflected with indignation too sharp to be wholly convincing. And threaded through all their accounts was the missing Keenon could say when it had last been seen, yet all was certain it had been in its jar. Hamish leaned back at last, letting the quiet gather again. Their words overlapped like mismatched puzzle pieces close enough to seem coherent, but not quite fitting. Someone had shared that final drink with Angus. Someone had locked the door and removed the key. And someone had placed a ribbon he despised across his lap as though signing their work. Outside, the frost had begun to melt under a weak winter sun. But inside Kilmore House, the chill only deepened. Hamish felt it in the cadence of their voices, in the way each guarded not just themselves, but something unspoken. The truth was there, woven between contradictions, waiting for a single thread to be pulled. Hamish left them seated in uneasy silence, and returned alone to the drawing room, closing the door softly behind him. Their words still echoed in his mind, overlapping and contradicting, but none alone carried the weight of certainty. Motive, he knew, was rarely singular. It layered itself like frost upon glass, obscuring the view until the warmth of logic cleared it. He stood once more before Angus MacCrae's body. Wealth had made the man powerful, but it had also made him resented. Greed was the obvious threadland disputes, development schemes, contracts that promised profit to some and ruin to others. Yet greed alone did not explain the theatricality of the ribbon, nor the careful wiping of the pistol. This had not been an impulsive act born of sudden rage. It had been staged, Morag's motive lay in inheritance and heritage both. If Angus died without altering his recent contracts, she would regain control of contested lands through legal complication. But her insistence on a fresh start suggested she believed reconciliation still possible. Killing him now would have risked suspicion falling squarely upon her. And yet, she had been quick to deny hearing the gunshot. Too quick. Callum Fraser's position was more precarious. As business partner, he stood to inherit Angus' shares temporarily under a contingency clause Hamish had glimpsed in papers upon the desk. With Angus gone, Callum would gain immediate control of pending developments. His eagerness to frame the death as suicide had not been subtle. Still, the man lacked the steadiness of a calculated killer. His confidence cracked under mild pressure. Unless, of course, that nervousness was its own performance. Fiona Grant's opposition had been ideological as much as political. She had blocked Angus' proposals publicly, arguing environmental impact and community interest. If Angus' influence continued, her position in the council might weaken. Yet murder would destroy her credibility utterly. Her indignation felt genuine, but so did the involuntary gesture toward her lips when lipstick was mentioned. A small tell, but a telling one. Then there were the MacLeans. Their estates bordered land Angus had sought aggressively. Refusal to sell had led to legal threats. Financial strain could drive men to desperate measures. Yet their synchronized accounts suggested pre-arrangement, as though they had compared stories before Hamish arrived. Why synchronize unless they feared inconsistency? He moved to the writing desk again, studying the second glass. Two people had shared that final drink. That meant conversation, perhaps argument. Angus had not retired alone in spirit, whatever he claimed. Someone had followed him into the drawing room, willingly or otherwise. The scrape near the door hinge returned to his thoughts. A thin object slid between jamb and lock enough to manipulate a key left inside. If the key had remained in the interior lock after being turned, it might have been nudged free, allowing the door to be locked from the outside and the key retrieved, which brought him back to the missing spare in the kitchen jar. If the interior key had been extracted and pocketed, the absence of the spare would serve to deepen the illusion. But why remove both? To confuse, to suggest impossibility. Hamish crossed to the mantel once more and examined the disturbed patch of dust beneath the crooked frame. Whatever had been removed had been small and light. Something decorative, perhaps. Something red? He glanced toward the corridor beyond the drawing room. Earlier, he had noticed faint glitter along the ribbon's edge. Glitter not from Christmas ornaments, but the heavier kind used on ceremonial sashes and rosettes at public events. Fiona Grant had presided over the Hogmanay lighting in the village square only days before. He remembered distinctly the crimson civic sash she had worn, edged with coarse glitter that caught the lamplight. Yet motive alone could not convict. If Fiona had killed Angus to halt his developments, she would not risk such a conspicuous clue, unless the ribbon was meant to point to her deliberately an accusation woven in satin. That possibility opened another path. If someone sought to discredit Fiona, they would require both opportunity and knowledge of her attire. Callum had attended the square ceremony. Morag too, the MacLeans as well. Hamish exhaled slowly. Greed tied to partnership. Revenge tied to land. Political rivalry tied to influence. Jealousy, perhaps Angus' rumoured affairs whispered about in corners of the village. Fear of financial ruin. Each motive intersected, overlapping like lines on a map. The key, the second glass, the manipulated lock. The ribbon stitched once to something larger non-contradicted one another, yet most single suspects satisfied them all. Whoever had done this had woven motive and misdirection together carefully. The question was not who hated Angus most, but who understood the others well enough to turn suspicion toward them. From the hall came the faint murmur of renewed conversation lower now, cautious. They were speaking among themselves, perhaps aligning stories further. Hamish slipped the ribbon once more from his pocket and ran his thumb along the torn edge. Threads clung unevenly, some longer than others, as though ripped from fabric in haste rather than cut cleanly. That suggested emotion and argument turned violent, an improvisation layered over premeditation. He looked again at Angus' still face. The answer lay not in a single motive, but in the intersection of several where personal gain met opportunity, and the desire to frame another. Somewhere in that tangle was the one thread that, once pulled, would unravel them all. Hamish slipped the ribbon back into his pocket and stepped into the corridor just as a constable from Strathbane arrived, red-faced from the cold and eager for resolution. Word had already travelled faster than the frost had melted. Within the hour, the house filled with the subdued urgency of official procedure photographs taken, statements noted again, the pistol bagged, the body prepared for removal. Routine settled over the chaos like a blanket. and with it came the comforting illusion of progress. It was the missing key that seemed to deliver the breakthrough. One of the uniformed men, searching the gravel beneath the drawing-room window more thoroughly now that the snow had thinned, called out sharply. There, half hidden beside a frozen shrub, lay a small brass key glinting faintly in the pale sunlight. It matched the drawing-room lock precisely. A murmur passed through those gathered. The implication was immediate and tidy. Someone inside had locked the door, tossed the key out the window, and staged the scene to resemble an impossible crime. Suspicion pivoted swiftly toward Morag. She had been closest to the window when the body was found. She alone, it was said, knew the old habits of the house intimately enough to rely on the spare key's location. And more damning still, when her coat was searched politely but firmly, a faint smear of nearly colourless lipstick was discovered in its inner pocket, the cap loose, the tip slightly blunted as if recently used. The shade, when compared against the faint trace on the second whiskey glass, seemed a close match. Callum's reaction was almost theatrical in its shock. "I knew it," he breathed, not quite convincingly. Fiona stood rigid, lips pressed thin, as though restraining either outrage or relief. The Macleans exchanged a glance too quickly suppressed. Morag's composure cracked at last. "This is absurd," she said, voice trembling but rising. "I did not kill my husband." "You argued with him?" the Strathbane sergeant pressed. "You stood to regain control of your land, and that makes me a murderer?" The evidence felt solid enough for the authorities. The key outside suggested deliberate locking from within and disposal. The lipstick linked her to the second glass. Her denial of hearing the gunshot now seemed convenient rather than plausible. By late afternoon, quiet talk of arrest drifted through the hall. Yet Hamish remained still, watching. He crouched once more beneath the window where the key had been found. The gravel was damp from melting frost, but there were no clear indentations where the key had landed. It lay too neatly beside the shrub, not embedded as a thrown object might be. If tossed with force from inside, it should have struck stone, perhaps left a mark on the sill, or scattered the gravel more widely. Instead it appeared placed. He rose slowly and looked up at the window latch. The interior ledge showed no fresh scratches consistent with a key being flung carelessly, and more troubling still, if Morag had locked the door from inside and thrown the key out, how had she exited? The window? There were no earlier footprints in the snow beyond those made during discovery. The frost along the sill had been undisturbed until Callum forced entry that morning. The timeline refused to bend neatly into the shape the evidence suggested. Inside, the sergeant spoke in low tones about formal charges. Morag sat pale but silent now, shock settling into stillness. Callum hovered nearby, offering murmured reassurances that rang hollow. Fiona stood apart, gaze fixed on the far wall. Hamish stepped toward the mantel again, studying the disturbed patch of dust beneath the crooked frame. The missing object still nagged at him. If Morag had acted alone in a fit of desperation, why the ribbon? Why the careful wiping of the gun? Why attempt such elaborate misdirection only to leave lipstick behind in her own pocket? Reached into his coat and withdrew the strip of red satin once more. Along its stitched edge, tiny flecks of darker fabric clung navy threads, nearly invisible against the crimson. He rubbed them gently between his fingers. Morag had worn grey that night. Callum had worn black. Fiona, however, had arrived in a deep navy dress beneath her winter coat. The early victory felt hollow, too convenient, like a stage set struck before the final act. Someone had placed the key where it would be found once the snow thinned. Someone had allowed suspicion to settle comfortably on Morag's shoulders, and somewhere within Kilmuir House, the true architect of the locked room watched events unfold, waiting to see whether the illusion would hold. Hamish glanced toward Fiona, just as she turned her head slightly away, as though sensing his scrutiny. For the briefest moment something flickered in her expression, not relief, not fear, but calculation. The case, it seemed, was not solved. It was only just beginning to reveal how carefully it had been designed. Hamish did not move his gaze from Fiona until she shifted first, smoothing an invisible crease along her sleeve before turning away. The flicker he had seen there was not grief, nor shock, nor even simple relief at suspicion falling elsewhere. It was recognition the kind that comes when a plan proceeds as intended, but perhaps not perfectly. He slipped the ribbon back into his pocket and asked quietly that everyone remain where they were. Instead of returning to the body, he stepped into the smaller sitting room adjacent to the hall. On its far wall hung framed photographs of village events, Hogmanay celebrations, summer fairs, council openings. He moved slowly along them until he found what he was looking for. A photograph from 3 nights earlier, in the village square. Lanterns glowed overhead, and in the centre stood Fiona Grant, smiling stiffly as she presided over the ceremonial lighting. Across her shoulder ran a deep crimson civic sash edged in coarse glitter, fastened with a silver clasp, shaped like a thistle. Hamish leaned closer. The glitter caught even the dim indoor light, thick and grainy, not the delicate shimmer of holiday tinsel. He reached into his coat and withdrew the ribbon, holding it near the glass. The flecks along its edge were identical, same coarse texture, same density, and along the stitched edge of the ribbon, he now noticed tiny perforations spaced evenly, as though once attached by small tacking stitches to heavier fabric. He glanced down at the photograph again. The sash bore a narrow crimson border sewn onto a navy base. If trimmed hastily, it would leave exactly such a strip. Footsteps sounded behind him. It was Callum. Still chasing ribbons? He asked lightly, but there was strain beneath the humour. Hamish did not answer at once. You were present at the square ceremony, he said instead. Aye, everyone was. And afterward, drinks at the inn, with Angus? Callum hesitated. For a time. Hamish turned slowly. You and Fiona have known each other long? Since university. And Morag, a family acquaintance. Business and politics often intersect, Hamish said mildly. Particularly when development is involved. Callum's expression tightened. What are you implying? That Angus did not only threaten land, he threatened reputations, and perhaps alliances. Callum looked away first. The past began to assemble itself in Hamish's mind, not merely land disputes, but an older matter, half remembered. 3 years earlier, there had been an inquiry into misallocated council funds intended for coastal preservation. The investigation had faltered for lack of concrete proof, though whispers had lingered. Angus had been one of the contractors bidding for the project. Fiona had chaired the review committee. Callum's firm had submitted preliminary designs that were later withdrawn quietly. No charges had followed, but the scandal had bruised careers. Hamish recalled now a heated exchange in the pub months ago, Angus boasting too loudly after whiskey that he kept copies of everything. At the time, it had sounded like drunken bluster. But what if it had not been? What if Angus had retained documents from that failed inquiry papers that could implicate not only council decisions, but private partnerships? He returned to the mantel in the drawing room and studied the disturbed dust again. Something small and rectangular had rested there before being removed. Not decorative or practical. A slim leather folder perhaps, or a packet of documents. It was not there now. If Angus had summoned Fiona privately after midnight, perhaps to threaten exposure, she would have motive far stronger than policy disagreement. If Callum's firm had also been entangled in that earlier inquiry, his eagerness to declare suicide might not have been mere self-interest, but self-preservation. The ribbon, then, might not have been meant to frame Fiona alone, but to signal something shared. A fragment torn in haste from her sash during a confrontation, or removed deliberately afterward to implicate her while protecting someone else. Hamish felt the strands tighten. This was not simply a quarrel over cottages or inheritance. It reached back to a buried scandal, one that had never quite surfaced but had left fractures beneath the surface of Lochdub's quiet respectability. Angus had held leverage, dangerous leverage, and perhaps had chosen the wrong moment to wield it. In the hall, voices murmured again, more anxious now as the afternoon light waned. The authorities believed they had their culprit in Morag. But the true crime had begun long before the New Year's toast, and its roots were tangled in ambition, secrecy, and fear. Hamish folded the ribbon carefully once more. The past had not stayed buried. It had simply waited, like frost beneath the soil, for the right pressure to crack the surface. And now, at last, the ground was beginning to split. The ground was beginning to split, but Hamish knew better than to confront it head-on without certainty. If Angus had indeed held documents from the old inquiry, and if those documents had vanished from the mantel sometime between midnight and morning, then the truth would not be pried loose by accusation alone. It would require pressure replayed carefully, precisely. He stepped back into the hall where the others waited under the strained politeness of enforced patience. The Strathbane sergeant was speaking in low tones with one of his men, clearly preparing to formalise Morag's arrest. Hamish raised a hand lightly. Before anyone is taken anywhere, he said, I'd like to try something simple. The sergeant frowned. We've found the key. The lipstick matches. What more a demonstration? Hamish interrupted gently. To settle the matter of the locked door. Curiosity overrode irritation. Within minutes they were gathered again in the drawing room. Angus' body had been removed, but the furniture remained undisturbed. Hamish asked the sergeant for the recovered key and requested a length of thin wire from the constable's kit. He then closed the door from the inside while they watched through the open window. He turned the key in the lock and left it there. "Observe," he called calmly. He slid the wire between the narrow gap at the hinge side of the very scrape he had noticed earlier. With slow, deliberate movements, he nudged the interior key upward until it slipped free of the lock and dropped softly onto the carpet inside. He then withdrew the wire, reached through the slightly opened window, and with a hooked motion, drew the fallen key across the floor, toward the sill, using the same wire fed beneath the door. A murmur rose from those watching. He opened the door and held up the key. One could lock the door from inside, extract the key from outside, and still possess it. The sergeant's expression shifted, uncertainty creeping in. "But that still leaves the question of the key found outside," Callum said quickly. "Too quickly." "Indeed," Hamish replied. He turned toward Fiona. "Counsellor, may I see the sash you wore at the Hogmanay lighting?" She blinked. "I don't have it with me." "Course not. It would be at your home." A faint flush crept up her neck. "Yes, then perhaps well fetch it." "There's no need," she said sharply, then moderated her tone. "It's irrelevant." Hamish let the silence linger again. "Humour me." What followed was not a search but a suggestion. He asked one of the constables to accompany Fiona to retrieve the sash. The weight stretched thin. Callum paced near the hearth. Morag sat motionless, eyes distant. The Macleans whispered to one another. When Fiona returned, the sash was folded tightly in her hands. Hamish accepted it without comment and unfolded the deep navy fabric. Along its lower crimson border, near the fastening clasp, was a narrow section that had been restitched hastily. The thread was slightly lighter than the original, the line uneven. "Did it tear?" Hamish asked mildly. "It caught on a nail in the square," she replied at once. "3 nights ago?" "Yes." "And you repaired it yesterday?" Her hesitation was barely perceptible. "Yes." Hamish laid the sash flat upon the table and placed the ribbon beside it. The width matched exactly. The glitter along the edge shimmered identically under the light. But it was not the fabric alone he watched, it was her hands. They had begun to tremble. "You see," he continued softly, "when fabric is torn in haste, the threads fray irregularly. Yet when cut deliberately, even roughly, the base fibres align. The ribbon found on Angus' lap shows both a clean cut at one end, a tear at the other." He lifted his eyes to hers. Almost as though it was trimmed first and then torn free in a struggle, Callum's pacing stopped abruptly. Fiona's composure fractured for a single second, not in words, but in breath. A sharp intake, involuntary, as though struck by memory. Her gaze flickered just onset toward Callum. That was the crack. Hamish turned slowly to Callum. "You were at university together," he said evenly. "You shared business interests during the preservation inquiry. If Angus had retained documents implicating both of you, exposure would have ruined more than a political career." Callum's face drained of colour. "That's speculation." "Perhaps," Hamish agreed. "But speculation becomes something firmer when 2 glasses are poured after midnight and one guest leaves wearing a sash missing its border." Silence thickened in the room. It was not confession he sought now, but fracture, and he could see Itef fragile alliance beginning to splinter under the weight of shared fear. The unconventional test had done its work, not by proving the method alone, but by forcing memory to surface too quickly, too vividly. Somewhere in that shared glance between Fiona and Callum lay the final piece. And Hamish knew that whatever happened next would no longer be concealed behind neat illusions of suicide or misplaced keys. The silence after that shared glance seemed to draw all warmth from the room. Fiona's breathing steadied, but only through visible effort. Callum straightened his jacket as though reclaiming composure by force. The sergeant shifted uneasily, sensing that the tidy solution he had nearly secured was dissolving into something far more complicated. "Well, take the sash as evidence," the sergeant said at last, reaching for it. Hamish nodded, but his eyes were already elsewhere in the mantle, on the thin layer of disturbed dust that still marked the outline of something missing. The sash explained the ribbon. The method explained the lock. But the motive required proof, and proof likely lay in whatever Angus had kept there. "He'll need to search the rest of the house," Hamish said quietly, "particularly Angus' study." The study lay at the rear of the house, a narrower room lined with dark shelves and locked drawers. The air inside smelled faintly of tobacco and paper. Hamish moved methodically, examining ledgers, correspondence, legal drafts. In the lower drawer of the desk, he found a shallow indentation in the felt linen rectangular, recently emptied. The shape matched the dust mark from the mantle, a leather folio perhaps, thin, portable. "Sergeant," he called, "did anyone leave the house after the body was discovered?" "No," came the reply. "We've kept watch." Yet someone had moved freely inside. Hamish felt the urgency sharpen. If Angus had confronted Fiona, and Callum after midnight threatening to expose past misconduct, then he would have needed leverage close at hand. He would not have left such documents lying carelessly elsewhere. The folio had been present during the confrontation. It had likely been seen, and now it was gone. He returned to the drawing room only to find a subtle but jarring change. The sash, which had been placed on the side table for bagging, was no longer there. The sergeant stared at the empty surface. It was here. It was Hamish agreed. The constables looked to one another, confusion edging toward alarm. No one had entered or exited. The doors remained guarded, windows latched. "Who has moved?" Hamish asked calmly. No one answered at once. Morag sat as before, pale and withdrawn. The Macleans had not left the hall. Callum stood near the hearth, arms folded tightly now. Fiona remained by the corridor leading toward the study. Hamish's gaze followed that corridor. He walked it slowly, heart steady though his thoughts raced. At the far end, near the coat stand, a faint shimmer caught his eye-coarse glitter dusting the dark wool of a coat sleeve. Navy wool. He reached out and brushed it lightly. The particles clung stubbornly. "Counsellor," he said without turning. "Your coat." Fiona stepped forward, face composed but bloodless. "Yes?" There's glitter along the cuff. "It's from the square," she replied quickly. "From the ceremony, perhaps," Hamish said. "Or perhaps from retrieving something you thought safer in your possession." Her composure cracked again smaller this time, but unmistakable. Callum moved suddenly. "This is absurd," he snapped. "You've no proof." "Not yet," Hamish replied evenly. "But someone has just removed a piece of evidence while under police watch. That requires opportunity." He turned back toward the study without warning and entered swiftly. A floorboard near the desk creaked faintly under his waiter, different tone than the others. He crouched and pressed along its edge. It lifted slightly, loose from recent disturbance. Beneath it lay a narrow cavity. Inside was the leather folio, but it was empty. The papers that might have tied past corruption to present murder were gone, removed within the last hour, destroyed or concealed elsewhere. Hamish replaced the board carefully and stood, the implications settling heavily. The sash had vanished. The folio's contents had vanished. Someone had acted while suspicion swirled around Morag using distraction as cover. Trust, already thin, fractured completely. Whoever had done this was bold enough to tamper with evidence in a house under watch. That meant desperation. It meant fear of what those documents contained. He stepped back into the corridor and faced them all. "The case is no longer about who pulled a trigger," he said quietly. "It's about who fears the truth most." Outside, the winter light faded toward evening, shadows lengthening across Lochdub. Inside Kilmuir House, the illusion of control had shattered. Evidence was disappearing. Alliances were fraying. And somewhere among them stood a murderer willing not only to kill, but to erase the past itself to remain free. Hamish felt the stakes rise like the tide against the harbour rocks. The next move would not be subtle, and whoever made it would reveal far more than they intended. The words had barely left Hamish's mouth when the front door burst open with a crash that echoed down the corridor. A young constable stumbled backward into the hall, breathless and wide-eyed. Sir Callum Fraser's gone. For a fraction of a second no one moved. Then every head turned toward the hearth. Callum was no longer there. The coat he had worn earlier was missing from the stand. The faint shimmer of glitter that had dusted Fiona's sleeve now trailed across the hallway floor in scattered flecks, leading toward the rear entrance. The back door stood ajar, cold air slicing into the house. "He slipped past while we were searching the study," the constable stammered. "Said he needed air. I thought you thought he was grieving," Hamish finished quietly. Outside, twilight had deepened into that thin blue hour when shapes blurred and distance deceived. Snow melt had turned the gravel slick, but the ground beyond still held patches of frost. Hamish stepped into the cold without hesitation, scanning the yard. Fresh footprints led away from the back door, cutting toward the line of trees that bordered the property, and descended toward the harbour road. "He's heading downhill," the sergeant said sharply. After him, but Hamish did not run immediately. His eyes traced not just the path ahead, but the interruptions along it. About 20 yards from the house, the footprints faltered, veering abruptly toward the old stone shed that had once stored gardening tools. The shed door hung half open. Hamish reached it first. Inside, the air smelled of damp wood and oil, and on the earthen floor, sprawled beside an overturned crate, lay Callum Fraser. He was not moving. The glittered sash lay crumpled near his hand, its navy fabric torn where the crimson border had been removed. Blood darkened the collar of his coat, seeping into the wool from a wound at the base of his skull. A blunt strike delivered from behind. The leather folio lay open beside him, empty. For a moment the only sound was the distant rush of the sea. The sergeant crouched, fingers seeking a pulse. His expression hardened. He's dead. The words settled like a second frost. Hamish straightened slowly, his mind already racing ahead of the shock. Callum had fled but not far. Someone had anticipated his flight, or followed him. The blow had been swift, decisive. The sash and folio were present, but the papers were still missing, which meant Callum had not destroyed them. He had retrieved the sash from the hall, likely intending to dispose of it, or use it as leverage. He had removed the folio from beneath the floorboard, but before he could do more, someone had silenced him. The killer was still inside Kilmore House, or had been moments ago. Hamish stepped back into the cold twilight and looked toward the house. In the upper window of the study, a faint movement flickered, curtains shifting, perhaps stirred by a draught or by a watcher. "Seal the property," he said evenly. "No one leaves." The sergeant barked orders. Constables moved quickly now, urgency replacing earlier complacency. The Macleans stood frozen in the yard, horror etched across their faces. Morag clutched the doorframe as though it were the only solid thing left in the world. Fiona stood apart, her expression unreadable, but her hands were clenched so tightly the knuckles shone white. Hamish's thoughts aligned with chilling clarity. Callum had known about the documents. He had likely shared involvement in the old inquiry, but his flight suggested fear not of arrest alone but of betrayal. If he had taken the folio to protect himself, then someone else had needed him silenced before he could speak. The glitter trail had not been accidental. It marked a path, but perhaps not only his. Hamish turned toward the study once more. The second murder had changed everything. This was no longer a crime of concealment alone, it was escalation, a desperate move to prevent exposure. The villain was not merely ahead, they were still playing. And now, with one conspirator dead and crucial evidence vanished, Hamish understood that solving Angus MacRae's murder was no longer enough. He would have to stop the killer before fear drove them to strike again. Hamish stood in the fading light outside the shed, the cold air sharpening his thoughts rather than dulling them. Callum's body lay where it had fallen, the sash crumpled near his hand like a discarded accusation. 2 murders within the span of a single afternoon, and yet the violence itself felt controlled, purposeful, not frantic, not chaotic. There was a rhythm to it. He walked back slowly toward the house, replaying each movement of the day in precise order. The discovery of Angos' body, the ribbon placed across his lap, the missing key, the conveniently found key in the gravel, the vanished sash, the empty folio, Callum's sudden flight, the fatal blow delivered before he could speak, not random axe responses. Every escalation had occurred immediately after pressure was applied. When Morag became the prime suspect, the key appeared. When Fiona's sash was exposed, it vanished. When the folio was discovered, Callum fled and was silenced. Someone had been watching Hamish progress carefully, adjusting in real time, which meant the killer had remained close enough to hear each development, close enough to move quickly without drawing attention. He stepped into the hall again. The constables were stationed now at every exit. The Macleans sat rigid in the sitting room, whispering less now, stunned into silence. Morag remained near the doorway, eyes red but steady. Fiona stood by the window looking outward into the darkening grounds. Hamish's gaze shifted to the coat stand. Earlier, he had noticed glitter on Fiona's cuff, but now he looked lower at the floorboards beneath. There, faint but distinct, were small crescent impressions in the wood dust, the mark of a narrow heel. Not from boots suited to the yard, but from indoor shoes. He recalled something else, something almost trivial at the time. When he had demonstrated the lock mechanism, everyone had stood clustered by the window. Everyone except one person. Fiona had lingered nearer the corridor. At the time, he had assumed discomfort. Now it seemed different. She had not wanted to stand where the key might have been manipulated again. She had avoided proximity to the demonstration. He turned slowly toward her. "Counsellor," he said quietly, "when Callum fled just now, where were you standing?" Her expression did not change. "Here, by the window. And when we searched the study, also here. Yet the shed lies behind the house, out of sight from this window. A flicker small, but there. I heard movement," she said evenly. "I assumed it was the constables." Hamish nodded faintly. "You are observant, then?" She did not answer. The pattern clarified further in his mind, not merely of actions, but of habit. Fiona had a habit of positioning herself at vantage points. At the Hogmanay ceremony, she had stood centrally, visible to all. During questioning, she had chosen places near exits, near corridors, always poised to move. And there was one more detail, an offhand remark she had made hours earlier, when first questioned. Angus never spoke softly, she had said. Yet Morag and the others had described raised voices after midnight, heated debate. If Fiona had left the hall before the argument intensified, she would not know the volume, unless she had been inside the drawing room, unless she had been the one arguing face to face. Hamish felt the final piece settle. The ribbon had not been meant to frame her. It had been an accidental fragment torn during a struggle when Angus grabbed at her sash. She had cut the rest away later to eliminate the mismatch, restitching it in haste. Callum, aware of the confrontation but perhaps not the murder itself, had panicked when the folio was found. He had attempted to retrieve it, perhaps to protect himself, perhaps to bargain. Fiona, realising he might confess, had followed and struck him down before he could. Every action traced back to preservation of reputation, preservation of power, and every adjustment had been made within arm's reach of Hamish's investigation. The key to the case had not been hidden in locks or ribbons, or even missing documents. It had been in her reactions, in her positioning, in the way she watched, not with shock but with calculation. Hamish met her gaze fully now. Outside, the last light drained from the sky, leaving only the dim reflection of the room in the window glass. In that reflection he saw not a grieving counsellor, but a strategist whose pattern had finally been understood. And now that he saw it, he knew the next move would decide everything. Hamish's gaze did not waver as he stepped closer to Fiona, the dim glow of the hallway lamplight casting her reflection across the window glass. Every movement she had Macbeth positioning near the corridor, the swift manipulation of the sash, the faint glitter trail across the floor coalesced into a single, chilling clarity. But understanding the pattern was only part of the story. He needed to uncover why. Why had she escalated from subtle misdirection to outright murder? Why had Callum been silenced? Why had the folio been rifled and the sash manipulated with such care? He began softly, deliberately. "Counsellor, why go to such lengths? To manipulate the key, remove the sash, follow Callum. All of it. Why?" Her posture stiffened, hands pressed into the sides of her coat. She did not answer immediately, as though weighing each syllable against the architecture of the room itself. "You see," she said at last, her voice quiet, almost detached, "people assume that power alone drives men to act. They assume greed, inheritance, politics. But it is not always those things." Hamish watched, letting the silence hold. "It was Angus," she continued, "who made me this way. Not by threats, not by business disputes, not by politics, but by undermining me, constantly. Whispered lies, insinuations, keeping me on edge for years. He wanted me cautious, anxious, afraid of missteps. I realised, over time, that fear could be manipulated, but it could also be weaponized." Hamish's brow lifted slightly. "You are saying this was about more than the land, or the folio, or even the council?" "Yes," she said. Her eyes glimmered with something cold and calculated. The council, the land, the documents, they were tools. I wanted control over him because control had been denied to me for so long. Angus believed himself untouchable because of wealth, because of influence. But power is fragile when someone knows your weaknesses. The revelation sent a subtle shiver through Hamish. He had anticipated desperation, self-preservation, even panic, but not a psychology honed into a weapon over years of subtle cruelty. This was not a single act of violence. It was the culmination of prolonged manipulation, a meticulous calibration of fear and opportunity, until the moment was perfect. "Callum?" Hamish asked. "He was involved or merely in your way?" She tilted her head, a ghost of regret, perhaps irritation crossing her features. "Callum, he panicked. He knew about the documents, but he did not understand the consequences as I did. I did not intend for him to die. But once he moved, once he threatened exposure, I had no choice. He had to be stopped, and it was the only way to ensure Angus never again." Hamish considered her words, the soft cadence betraying the detachment behind them. This was not about revenge in the conventional sense. It was about the reshaping of reality around a long-standing grievance, the assertion of psychological dominance over those who had tormented her, directly and indirectly. Years of slights and whispered manipulations had hardened into an obsessive resolve. "The folio?" he asked. "The documents?" Her lips pressed into a thin line. "They contained proof of every slight, every interference, every misstep that could have ended my career. I needed to remove the risk. And once Callum interfered, he became part of the risk." Hamish stepped closer, absorbing the meticulous logic. The crime had seemed almost random, then opportunistic. then a tangled web of misdirection. But it was never random. It was deliberate. Each move of ribbon, the key, the folio, the silencing of Calamoise, an extension of her long-standing need for control, perfected into lethal precision. Outside, the wind gusted across Lockstub, rattling the window panes, but inside, the chill belonged entirely to the revelation. He could see now that the villainy had not been born of sudden greed or panacit had been cultivated over years, a psychological lattice of fear, resentment, and cunning. Hamish inhaled slowly. The crime was not simply solved, it had been exposed, stripped of pretense. The villain was before him, composed, rational in her own mind, and yet capable of extremes that most could not fathom. The true motive was far darker, far deeper than any inheritance or business quarrel. It was the desire to dominate, to prevent vulnerability, and to rewrite the past into a narrative she controlled completely. And now that he understood, Hamish realised the final steps would not rely merely on logic or deduction but on the delicate manoeuvring required to bring someone so psychologically resolved to justice without giving her another chance to strike. Hamish waited until the house was quiet again. The constables remained stationed, but he instructed them to keep a measured distance enough to observe, not enough to interrupt. He needed Fiona to feel her control intact, to believe she still dictated the pace. That was part of the trap. He approached her calmly, hands folded behind his back. "Counsellor," he said, his voice low but carrying authority, "I think we should revisit the shed." Her eyes flickered briefly, betraying a flicker of unease, but she masked it with a small, tight smile. "Why?" "To understand fully how events unfolded," he said evenly. "I need to see the path one last time, with all evidence present or absent as it may be." She followed him with the slightest hesitation, her pace deliberate, every movement measured. Hamish noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers flexed briefly against the sash of her coat. Every detail reinforced the pattern he had discerned, the careful, calculated presence of someone accustomed to anticipating each step of others. When they reached the shed, Hamish stopped just inside, letting the door swing gently behind them. "Callum attempted to retrieve something here," he said quietly, gesturing to the spot where the folio had lain. "You know that, of course." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "Yes," the second followed him. "To be certain." "Certainly," Hamish murmured, allowing the word to hang, but someone else interfered before he could act. "He was silenced here, wasn't he?" She froze, the movement almost imperceptible. "Yes," she whispered, "and yet the documents were never recovered." "Which leaves me wondering," Hamish continued, stepping closer, "where you placed them. Or if perhaps they were destroyed." Her breath caught small, almost inaudible. The first crack in the facade. Hamish circled slowly, examining the floorboards, the crates, the slight indentation in the earthen floor. All the movements, the sash, the ribbon, the key, none of it random. Each of your steps has left a trace, consciously or not, and you have made one final miscalculation. Fiona's hands rose slightly, brushing a strand of hair back from her face, a gesture more nervous than casual. "What miscalculation?" she asked, voice steadier than she felt. "You underestimated the constables outside," Hamish said softly, "and more importantly, you underestimated my understanding of patterns. The same logic that explained your movements explains your psychology, your need to control, your methodical removal of evidence, and it also reveals where your risk became absolute." Her composure faltered, fingers tightening on the sash at her waist. "I did what had to be done," she said, but the calm assertion could not hide the tremor beneath it. Hamish advanced a single, deliberate step. "Counsellor, the only way out of this shed without exposure is through me, through the door, and beyond that, every exit is guarded. There is no escape." Her eyes darted toward the small window, then back, and Hamish noted the fraction of a second when she considered desperate action, perhaps a strike, a sprint, or even another concealed weapon, but she abandoned the thought. The logic of her own pattern, now fully mapped, blocked her instinct. "Confess," he said quietly. "Not for the law alone, but for yourself. The tangled web you wove, the lives taken, the fear imposed, it cannot remain hidden. And the evidence, however briefly removed, is still remembered. Every step you took leaves a trace." She swallowed, the breath audible now. I couldn't allow him to ruin everything," she whispered, the first genuine hint of vulnerability breaking through. Hamish's eyes softened slightly, though his posture remained firm, and in trying to preserve control, "You lost it entirely. There is no judgment here but truth, and truth will guide the rest." Fiona's shoulders slumped. She set the sash on the floor, fingers lingering over it, and exhaled shakily. "Yes, she admitted finally. "It was me. I couldn't let him expose me, and then Callum—" "I didn't mean—" Hamish nodded, giving her the moment to surrender fully to the acknowledgement. The constable stepped forward only once she dropped her hands completely, ensuring the confession was voluntary, controlled, and undeniable. The trap had worked. Not through threat or force, but through the meticulous mapping of patterns, the careful reading of psychology, and the quiet pressure of inevitability. Fiona's desperate need for control, honed over years, had led her to the very place where that control could no longer protect her. Hamish breathed slowly, letting the tension drain from his shoulders. The final confrontation had concluded not with chaos, but with clarity. And at last, the true architect of the crimes stood exposed, her motives laid bare, her intricate designs fully unravelled. The constables led Fiona carefully toward the main hall, her surrender complete, her earlier poise replaced by a pallid, controlled despair. Hamish watched them go, eyes narrowing slightly as he retraced the steps through the shed and back into the main house. Everything had aligned, at least it seemed so. The sash, the ribbon, the folio, the murders, the pattern of behaviour, it all pointed squarely to Fiona. The case appeared closed, tidy, almost too neat. And that, Hamish thought, was precisely what made him uneasy. He returned to the drawing room, examining the mantel one last time. The thin layer of dust still bore the faint indentation of the folio, the spot where Angus had lain. The key that had once been tossed in the gravel. All the elements were accounted for, so it seemed. It was then that he noticed the photograph on the side table, one he had passed countless times without a second thought. A group shot from the Hogmanay celebration. Angus, Callum, Fiona, and a fourth figure in the background, partially obscured. A fleeting face, barely perceptibly a shadowed figure in a dark coat, standing slightly apart, smiling faintly as if amused by the scene. Hamish's pulse quickened. He remembered that face seen only once before, briefly, in passing at the village square. The moment had seemed inconsequential at the time, a stranger observing, half hidden, an onlooker content to remain unnoticed. But now, with the case supposedly resolved, the memory surfaced with a cold clarity. He moved swiftly to the window, scanning the darkening grounds of Kilmore House. No one was visible, but the angle of the fading light revealed footprints that had not been accounted for smaller. Lighter prints intersecting with the path Callum had taken toward the shed. They diverged toward the old boathouse by the shore, a structure Hamish had not examined closely. "Sergeant," he called, summoning the nearest constable, "secure the perimeter immediately. There's been another presence here, and I suspect it's recent." The officer frowned. "We've been guarding every exit, sir. No one's left." "Yet someone did," Hamish said evenly, pointing toward the footprints. "And it is the only explanation for what I am about to uncover." He moved to the boathouse with two constables, the snow crunching underfoot. The building smelled of salt and old timber, damp and hollow. Hamish's gaze swept the interior. Empty barrels, overturned crates, fishing nets, but then his eyes fell on a small, leather-bound notebook wedged between two crates. Its edges were frayed, the cover scuffed. He recognised the handwriting, immediateless pedigree, precise, deliberate. Not Fiona's, not Callum's. He flipped the cover. The entries inside detailed observations of Angus, Callum and Fiona. Meetings, arguments, locations, habits. Dates, times, even minor gestures noted meticulously. There was a plan outlined, how to manipulate suspicion, how to use the key, the ribbon and the sash as misdirection. Every act, every escalation had been guided, overseen, orchestrated not solely by Fiona, but by this unseen hand. Hamish felt a chill settle. Fiona had executed the murders, yes, but she had been guided, nudged, her reactions anticipated. Someone else had shaped the chaos, remained in the shadows, and allowed events to unfold until the moment seemed obvious. He turned back to the house, the pieces clicking into place. The fourth figure in the photograph was no longer a mere observer, they were the true architect. The murders, the misdirection, even the panic of Callum every step had been orchestrated with cold precision. The sergeant's voice broke through his thoughts. "Sir, what now?" Hamish's gaze hardened, sharp with resolve. "Now we find the person who has been orchestrating from the shadows. Fiona may have carried out the acts, but the mind behind the manipulation is still at large. And if we do not act quickly..." He left the boathouse, moving with the calm urgency of a man who understood that the final twist could strike at any moment. Outside, the wind whipped across Lochdub, carrying the faint scent of the sea, the snow, and something more sinister knowledge that the case, though seemingly solved, had one last layer yet to reveal. The true mastermind remained free, and the night was far from over. Hamish returned to Kilmuir House as darkness fell, the chill of the wind cutting through the heavy wool of his coat. The constables had secured Fiona in the main hall, her posture resigned, hands folded tightly in front of her. She had confessed, her crimes laid bare, yet the notebook he had found at the boathouse refused to settle the case. It was a guiding hand, a shadow that had orchestrated events with patient calculation, one step ahead of every observer. Justice for the murders could be delivered, yes, but the architect of the chaos remained elusive, a ghost hidden in plain sight. He called the constables together, spreading the notebook on the table and pointing to the meticulous entries. "Notice the handwriting here," he said, tracing a finger along the spidery script. "Every escalation, every disappearance, every misdirection has been documented before it happened." Fiona executed the acts, but she did so following guidance she thought was intuition. That guidance came from someone who studied her, anticipated her reactions, and manipulated events until suspicion pointed elsewhere. The sergeant frowned. "So, someone else orchestrated all this, but we have no idea who?" "Exactly," Hamish said. "Look at the small details missed earlier. The shadow in the photograph at the Hogmanay ceremony, the unseen footsteps in the hallway that didn't match anyone in the house, the subtle displacement of objects that suggested more than one hand moving in the dark. Every act seemed self-contained, but when you connect the dots, the pattern emerges. Someone ensured that Fiona, Callum, and even Morag would act in predictable ways. The chaos we observed was carefully curated. Fiona, sitting quietly, looked up with a mixture of fear and awe. I thought I was in control," she murmured. "I never realised someone else was guiding me." Hamish's gaze softened slightly. "Control is an illusion. You were driven by fear and opportunity, but someone else had mapped your instincts, predicted them, and used them to their advantage." He paused, letting the weight of the revelation sink in. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes, carrying the dark quiet of the night across Lochdub. Justice for the murders Angus and Callum's was now secured. Fiona would face the law, and her confession combined with the physical evidence made her culpability undeniable. Yet Hamish knew the mastermind was still free, somewhere observing, somewhere perhaps preparing another move. He turned back to the mantel and the empty folio, running his finger along the faint dust outline. The notebook shows us that every small action had meaning. The removed sash, the glitter trail, the manipulated Keithy were all signals, distractions, pieces of a larger puzzle. Most would have seen them as random or irrelevant. Few noticed the footprints in the snow that didn't match anyone present, the tiny adjustments to the room's arrangement, the consistency of the observer's hand in every event. That is how the mind behind the chaos remained hidden until now. The sergeant shook his head. "So the real criminal escapes?" Hamish nodded slowly. "For now. But we know their methods, their habits, their way of thinking. Whoever guided Fiona has a style, and patterns repeat even in the most careful minds. That knowledge gives us the upper hand. Justice, in part, has been served, but full resolution requires patience. The unseen hand will act again eventually, and when it does, we will be ready." Fiona's eyes widened slightly, the final weight of her actions settling upon her. She would answer for what she had done. Yet the haunting presence of the true mastermind lingered in the house, in the wind, in the faint trail of glitter along the floorboards, and in the empty spaces where documents once lay. Hamish breathed deeply, knowing that while the immediate danger was contained, the game itself was not over. Lochdub had survived one storm of violence, but another, quieter, more insidious one, was still at large, and only a mind attuned to patterns could hope to uncover it when the time came. He stepped outside, the last light fading behind the hills, and for a moment the village seemed calm. Yet Hamish knew better. Beneath that calm lay the intricate designs of a mind still at work, waiting, watching, and testing how far control could reach. Justice had been served in part, but the shadows remained, and in those shadows the final move had yet to be made. Hamish walked slowly down the slope from Kilmore House toward the frozen loch, the air crisp and sharp against his cheeks. The constables had taken Fiona away, the last vestige of immediate chaos leaving only the echo of her confession in the halls behind him. The murders had been solved, the pattern uncovered, the unseen manipulator identified, at least in method, if not in identity. Yet the night felt heavier, as though some small weight had not been accounted for. He paused at the edge of the loch, gazing at the ice reflecting the pale moonlight. Something tugged at the back of his minder detail, dismissed too easily in the midst of frenzy. The glittered trail from the sash, the displaced key, the foiled flight of Calumthy, all pointed outward from Kilmuir itself. But the boathouse notebook, meticulous and precise, had not included one entry, a cryptic annotation, scrawled at the very back, in handwriting slightly different from the rest. It was a single word, barely legible, Lochdub. Hamish frowned. He had seen the word before, in passing in a map of local council holdings, marked in the corner of an old ledger that Angus had consulted. He had assumed it was merely a reference to land. Now, in context, it felt more like a signpost, a breadcrumb left deliberately. Someone wanted to ensure that, even if everything seemed resolved, attention would return here.
He ran a gloved hand across the surface of the ice, tracing the reflection of the moon with a finger,
thinking of the footprints that had led from the house to the shed, and the subtle path beyond toward the boathouse. All the movements made sense, no but that final word, the different hand, hinted at continuity. A lingering presence, perhaps a message for the observant, or a signal that the story was far from finished. The village below was silent, save for the occasional cry of a gull over the loch. Hamish's eyes drifted to the windows of Kilmuir House, lit faintly in the distance. One could believe the night peaceful, that justice had been delivered. Yet he knew that peace was an illusion, thin and temporary, like frost melting beneath the morning sun. A small envelope caught his attention, wedged into the outer doorframe of the boathouse, unnoticed until now. He retrieved it carefully, turning it over in his hands. There was no name, no seal, only a single sentence in careful, slanted handwriting. Observe carefully, control is never absolute. Hamish exhaled slowly, the faintest trace of a smile crossing his lips. The immediate danger had passed. Fiona would answer for her crimes. The murders would be explained, the evidence accounted for. Yet this note, cryptic and understated, reminded him that no matter how neatly a case seemed to conclude, the threads of human cunning and fear were never fully severed. Someone else had been watching, learning, leaving subtle reminders that the game was ongoing. He pocketed the note and began walking back along the icy path, mind already cataloguing the details, patterns, and possibilities. The village slept, oblivious to the layers of strategy and calculation that had played out in the quiet hours. Hamish knew that another mystery waited just beyond the horizon Somione, somewhere, plotting with patience and precision. And when that time came, he would be ready. For now, the snow fell lightly over Lochdub, glittering like tiny signals in the moonlight, each flake a whisper of secrets yet untold. Justice had been served, yet the shadows remained. And Hamish, walking steadily along the frozen loch, felt the quiet thrill of anticipation for the next case, knowing that in a world of cunning and deceit, mysteries never truly enthigh, simply await the observant eye. The night stretched on, calm yet charged, and Hamish Macbeth, ever watchful, vanished into the silvered landscape, leaving the village beneath him to sleep, while the quiet knowledge lingered. One more twist, one more clue, one more story would always lie ahead.